I still remember that evening with perfect clarity. It was the first time in our many years of marriage that my husband, Alex, had insisted I come with him to his company's corporate dinner. It sounded like a simple event, but from the moment he mentioned it, a quiet alarm bell started ringing in the back of my mind. Alex was a private man, a hard worker who rarely brought office politics home. He especially disliked dragging me to these kinds of functions unless it was absolutely necessary. That evening, he stood in front of his closet for a long time, changing his mind twice between two different dress shirts. I could tell something was weighing on him. When I asked, he just gave me a strained smile and said the company had booked a major hotel ballroom, and everyone was bringing their spouse, so he wanted me to come along and have a nice night out. The answer sounded plausible, but there was no excitement in his eyes. Just before we left, he leaned in and told me quietly, "Later, if things get awkward, just stay close to me." That one sentence confirmed my suspicion. Tonight was not going to be peaceful. The hotel where his company held the event was called the Crestview Ballroom, a grand establishment on a main avenue, its entrance glowing from the curb all the way to the lobby. Valet parking was a flurry of activity, and a line of uniformed staff stood ready, each with a perfectly professional smile. Inside, crystal chandeliers glittered above a marble floor, so polished it reflected our images as we walked. Honestly, one look was enough to know this wasn't a place for ordinary company dinners. It felt more like a stage. And on any stage, some people are meant to be elevated, while others are brought out to be made an example of. The moment Alex and I stepped into the ballroom, I noticed a few strange glances. It wasn't the usual polite curiosity for the new face of an employee's wife. It was the look of people who had been told something in advance, who were waiting for a show to begin. A few female colleagues looked at me, then leaned in to whisper to each other. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes hesitated for a split second as he passed. I didn't understand everything, but my intuition told me we had just walked into a carefully set trap. Just then, Alex's direct supervisor, Frank Thompson, approached us. He wore a tailored black suit, his hair slicked back with gel. He had a slight punch and a permanent smile on his face, but his eyes were cold. He extended a press-it hand to Alex, shaking it with a grip that was a little too tight, a small power play, I could see even from the side. His voice was cheerful, but every word felt like it had a barb. Well, Alex. Brought the wife along tonight, did you? Excellent. Good for the team to finally meet her. Alex stiffened for a moment, but maintained his composure, nodding politely. Yes, sir. I wanted to bring her so she could get to know everyone. My heart ached for him. He was not a weak man, but in front of a superior, there are times you have to swallow your pride to protect your livelihood, to hold on to a job you've dedicated years to. Frank Thompson turned his gaze to me, looking me up and down. That evening, I was wearing a simple, long-sleeved silk blouse in a muted color and tailored trousers, with my hair in a neat bun. I wore minimal jewelry and light makeup. He gave a faint, dismissive smirk. Yes, good to network. But a seat has to be in the right place. A few people standing nearby overheard and let out quiet, knowing chuckles. I didn't respond. I just looked him straight in the eye for a second, long enough to understand that the right place he was talking about wasn't a matter of simple seating arrangements. It was a premeditated humiliation. As the guests began to find their seats, staff members guided people to their assigned tables. The central table in the middle of the room was for the prasa table. Executive leadership and employees considered high potentials. The surrounding tables were bright and lively, filled with cheerful conversation and laughter. But at the very back of the room, near a service exit leading to the hallway, was a much smaller table. The lighting there was dimmer, and the tablecloth wasn't as crisp as the others. I glanced over and saw a few of the building's security guards, a member of the Rasable Lay janitorial staff, and one of the maintenance workers sitting there, all looking deeply uncomfortable. An event staffer started to lead us toward one of the main tables, but we hadn't taken 2 steps before Frank's voice boomed across the room. Not that table. The Hendersons are over there, closer to the rank and file. Helps build camaraderie. The entire ballroom went silent for a beat, then a few scattered laughs erupted. Some people turned away, others pretended to take a sip of their drink. But everyone knew exactly what he had just done. I distinctly heard a male voice from the central table mutter, "Guess everyone has their level." Alex froze, and I felt his hand clench mine lightly under the cover of my sleeve. He leaned close, his voice so low only I could hear. "Elena, please just bear with me for a little bit. I don't want to make a scene." Hearing that, my heart broke a little more. I knew my husband wasn't a coward. If he had been alone, he might have turned around and walked out. But with me there, with the eyes of his entire company on him, he was trapped. Sometimes, the greatest pain for a man isn't the insult itself, but knowing he's being insulted and having to stand there and take it. I turned to him and gave a small, reassuring nod. No blame, no anger. Then I was the one who walked forward, pulled out a chair at that small table, and sat down. I smiled at the others sharing our table. "Well, it's a pleasure to be sitting with you all tonight." They looked surprised. One of the security guards, a man in his 50s with sun-weathered skin, stammered, "Ma'am, you saying that makes us feel a little less awkward, but we all know this isn't right." I smiled warmly, poured a glass of water for my husband, then offered the pitcher to the security guard and the others at the table. I did it naturally, as if this was exactly where I was supposed to be. From the central table, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses continued, but I didn't look over anymore. I sat up straight, slowly placing my hand over my husband's on the table, a silent message. "I'm here." But inside, a cold resolve was setting in. I understood perfectly. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a carefully orchestrated takedown. And they thought that by seating us with the security and cleaning staff, they could make us bow our heads. They had no idea that some people, when pushed down to the very bottom, see the true faces of those at the top most clearly. Sitting at that last table of the evening, my hand resting on my husband's, my mind was pulled back to the years before. Perhaps I should start from there, so you can understand why I didn't storm out, why I didn't drag my husband away in a fit of anger, but chose to stay. Because the man beside me was no coward. He was anything but a bad husband. He was the man who had walked with me through every hardship. It was just that on this particular night, he had been pushed into a trap that was all too obvious. "My name is Elena." At that point, Alex and I had been married for 6 years. 6 years isn't long enough to be an old married couple, but it's long enough for a woman to know if she married the right man or the wrong one. My family wasn't wealthy, and we certainly weren't the type to post every little thing online to prove we were better than others. Alex and I lived a comfortable, quiet life. We saved what we earned, and it was enough to eat well, dress well, and keep a peaceful roof over our heads. Alex was a straight shooter. Everything he did was transparent. If something was right, he said it was right. If it was wrong, he said it was wrong. In everyday life, that quality earned him respect. But in a corporate environment, it wasn't always an advantage, especially in a place where many people climbed the ladder not by their abilities, but by knowing how to read their superiors' moods and sweeten their words accordingly. Alex didn't know how to do that, or perhaps more accurately, he refused to. He often told me, "If you do a job, you should be able to do it with your head held high. I can't spend my days staring at other people's faces, trying to guess what they want to hear." As for me, if I'm being honest, my job wasn't as mundane as my appearance might suggest. I work in operations for a major service and hospitality chain. I'm used to handling problems, looking at situations from multiple angles, and reading people from a few glances and a handful of words. But I never liked to talk about my work. I especially disliked introducing myself by my title or by listing the important people I knew. I always felt that if those things had real value, they would speak for themselves. If you had to constantly announce them, they probably weren't very solid to begin with. In the first few years of our marriage, Alex had a very difficult time at his company. It wasn't because he was incompetent, but because he refused to join the cliques that spent their time flattering the higher-ups. He also refused to cut corners just to get a job done. Some nights, he would come home with a stack of reports and sit at his desk until the early hours, his face tense with stress. It hurt me to see him like that, so I would quietly sit with him. Sometimes I helped him reformat spreadsheets. Other times, I'd help him restructure a presentation to be clearer. And sometimes, I just listened as he vented all his frustrations, helping to lighten his load. It became a routine. Whenever he faced a problem, he didn't hide it from me. And if I saw something that didn't seem right, I'd tell him directly. Once, I noticed a discrepancy in the data for his department's new project plan. If he had presented it as it plan was, it would have been a disaster. I told him to double-check it. After reviewing it, he sat in silence for a long time before letting out a huge sigh. If it wasn't for you, I would have been crucified in that meeting tomorrow. I just smiled and said something I still remember to this day. A marriage is about carrying each other. If we only got married to eat at the same table, what would be the point? One night, he was leaning against the headboard, his eyes red with fatigue, and he said quietly, "Without you, I think I would have quit this job a long time ago." Hearing that, I felt a mix of love and amusement. I handed him a warm glass of water. Quitting is your decision. But I married you, so when you're strong, I'm by your side, and when you're tired, I'm by your side too. That was how we lived. No drama, no grand promises, but we both knew, deep down, that we were each other's truest support. From the very beginning, Alex and I had an unspoken agreement. In the professional world, he was the one on the front lines, dealing with his boss, his colleagues, his work. I stood in the background. I didn't take credit, didn't make frequent appearances, and I certainly didn't want anyone whispering that Alex had to rely on his wife to get ahead. That's why, even though Alex often wanted to introduce me more formally to his colleagues, I always waved it off. I told him it didn't matter what other people thought, as long as we understood each other. Because I chose to take a step back, in the eyes of many people at his company, I was just a very ordinary wife. They probably thought I spent my days in the kitchen, that I was meek, quiet, and not someone to pay attention to. I wasn't bothered by it, but as time went on, I began to realize that the environment where my husband worked was no longer a place where talented people were valued. Those who were skilled at flattery and sucking up rose quickly. But those who did the real work and spoke the truth, like Alex, were constantly scrutinized and labeled as difficult to manage. Among those people, Frank Thompson was the powerless one who caught my attention the most. He was the type of person who loved using his power to force others to submit. For him, making his subordinates fear him seemed more important than managing the work effectively. I had warned Alex a few times to be careful around him, but my husband, with his usual straightforwardness, just smiled and said, "If I'm doing the right thing, I have nothing to fear." I didn't argue. I just felt a strange, nagging premonition in my heart. Because people like Frank Thompson aren't really afraid of those who make mistakes. A person who makes a mistake is easy to control, to bend, to break. The type of person he truly despised was the one who dared to do the right thing, who dared to see his flaws and not be afraid. And sitting at that last table that night, surrounded by the security guards, the janitor, and the maintenance workers, I knew one thing for certain. What we were enduring wasn't a random act. It was the result of a long simmering resentment, just waiting for the right occasion to boil over. As I listened to the clinking of glasses from the other tables, my mind replayed the days leading up to the dinner. It didn't really start at the Crestview Ballroom, nor did it start when Frank Thompson pointed us to the table with the support staff. It had begun a few days earlier, when my husband received a very strange text message. It was in the afternoon, just after Alex had gotten out of the shower, when his phone lit up. He picked it up and read the message, his brow furrowing slightly. I was folding laundry nearby and asked, "Who's that from? You look annoyed." He handed me the phone. The message was from Jessica, Frank's assistant. It was just one sentence. "Frank says to remember to bring your wife to the dinner." On the surface, it seemed normal. But the strange thing was, Alex's company had never before required employees to bring their spouses to internal functions. Alex sat down on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. "What do you think he means by this?" I asked him. "What are you going to reply?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'll probably just say you're busy." That sounded reasonable to me. Knowing Alex, he didn't want me involved in the company's social events, especially when he knew there were people there who didn't like him. But before he could even type a reply, his phone rang. It was Frank. I couldn't hear what was being said on the other end, but I could guess. From the look on my husband's face. Alex stood up, walked over to the window, and gave a series of short, formal responses. A minute later, he turned back to me with a humorless smile. It's not a suggestion anymore. It's an order. I asked what he had said. Alex pulled a chair out and sat across from me, his voice low. He said a man needs his family behind him, so the team can see it. He made it sound all friendly and encouraging, but I know that tone. It wasn't an invitation, it was a demand. I looked at my husband and saw the conflict written all over his face. He didn't want me to go. Not because he was ashamed of me, but because he knew how toxic that environment could be. I'd lived with him long enough to know that with just one look. Sure enough, Alex sighed and continued, if you don't want to go, I'll find an excuse. I can just say you're not feeling well. I put down the pile of clothes, looked him straight in the eye, and said, no, I'm going. Alex looked up, surprised. I don't want you to have to listen to their nonsense. I replied, if they're targeting you, then I have to be there. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. After I said that, Alex was silent for a long time. Then he just nodded, no longer arguing. I knew he was still uneasy, because in the days leading up to this, Frank had started to show his animosity toward my husband more openly. It was no longer about small disagreements at work. It was a targeted campaign of nitpicking. One day he'd criticize the formatting of a report. The next he'd use a 3-minute delay to a meeting to make snide remarks about work ethic. One evening, Alex came home late, loosened his tie, and sank into a chair, saying only, when someone wants to find fault, they'll always find something. I poured him a glass of warm water, sat beside him, and asked for the details. It was only then that Alex told me about an incident he thought was minor, but I knew immediately it was anything but. A few weeks prior, during a meeting that included clients, Frank had presented a client's project plan with a projected revenue figure that was significantly off. Alex, who was in charge of the source data, saw the problem immediately. The easiest thing to do would have been to stay silent, to not rock the boat or make his analysis boss look bad. But Alex stood up and said, very directly, sir, I believe there might be a mix-up here between 2 fiscal quarters. If we leave the number as is, the forecast will be inaccurate. He told me. The room went dead silent. Frank stared at him for a few seconds, then forced a smile and said, yes. I'll have a look at that. On the surface, it looked like he took the correction well. But anyone who has spent time in that kind of environment knows that some smiles are far more dangerous than being yelled at. Because after that meeting, Frank's attitude toward Alex changed completely. It was no longer a vague coldness. It was a deliberate hostility, just waiting for an opportunity to strike. After hearing my husband's story, I said only one thing. A man like that doesn't forget. Alex sat quietly, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the Faust floor. I knew he understood. He just didn't want to believe that a man in a self-leadership position could be so petty as to hold a grudge against an employee for correcting a mistake in a meeting. But the more I heard about a man like Frank, the more certain I was that for people like him, ego is more important than the work itself. Bruise their ego once, and they will remember it for a very long time. When the official invitation card arrived, my premonition grew stronger. The card was addressed not just to Alex Henderson, but elegantly, printed below, was and guest. Holding the invitation, I didn't see a polite request, but rather an announcement that the roles had been cast, and the actors were now being summoned to the stage. I folded the card, set it on the table, and told my husband, this isn't a social event. They're setting a stage for you. Alex looked up at me and gave a DBO tired smile. I figured as much. I didn't say anything more. I just quietly prepared my clothes, prepared my mind, and prepared for the worst-case scenario. I wasn't going to prove I was better than anyone, nor was I going to put on a show. I was going because I knew that if things went too far, I couldn't let my husband stand alone in the middle of that crowd. And deep down, I also wanted to see for myself just how far a man in a position of power would go to humiliate a subordinate for a single act of integrity. From the moment I suspected the dinner was a trap, the face of Frank Thompson kept appearing in my mind. Not because he was particularly formidable, but because I had seen his type so many times before. In life, some people intimidate you because they are overtly aggressive. But there are others who are far more dangerous because they always smile, always speak softly, and always act deferential in front of their own superiors, only to turn around and crush those beneath them. Frank Thompson was the latter. Even though I didn't work at the same company, just from the few stories Alex told me and the couple of times I had seen him at rare company-wide events, I knew he was a man who lived with two faces. In front of the senior executives, he was always obsequious, smiling, and nodding agreeably. Every other word was, yes, sir, and, of course. He acted like the most reasonable, mild-mannered manager you could imagine. But, with his own team, it was a different story. He was abrasive and authoritarian, demanding that everyone fall in line with his thinking. And if he took a dislike to someone, he would make their life a living hell. The thing that struck me most about Frank was that he didn't just like to manage people. He loved to perform his power. To most, corporate dinners and client events were networking and team building. To him, they were a stage. On that stage, who sat at which table, who got to raise a glass first, who was allowed to speak, and who was called up to be made a fool of, none of it was random. He orchestrated everything. And the larger the audience, the more he enjoyed it. Because only with many witnesses did he feel his power was truly significant. Alex had once told me a story that I never forgot. Not long ago, at an internal end-of-year party, there was a new hire, a young man who was honest but a bit socially awkward. He had politely declined an extra drink, explaining he had a stomach issue. For that small act, Frank's face immediately darkened. He smiled, but in front of the whole table, he said, "If you can't drink, then stand over there and pour for your colleagues. Learn to observe." It sounded like a joke, but he was serious. He made that young man stand by the patient table and pour drinks for the entire evening. No one dared to say a word in his defense. The young man stood there, his face beet red, while Frank sat comfortably, laughing and chatting as if he had just invented a very amusing game. Alex paused after telling me that, his expression clearly disturbed. I asked, "And no one said anything?" He shook his head with a bitter smile. Everyone knew it was out of line, but no one wanted to cross him. I understood how my husband felt. To watch someone be humiliated in public and be still unable to speak up, that kind of frustration doesn't erupt into noise. It just simmers, quietly, inside you. Through stories like these, I began to see a clear pattern. Frank Thompson especially liked to target those who refused to flatter him. The more you sucked up to him, the more you trailed after him, laughed at his jokes, and read his moods, the easier your life would be. But if you were straightforward, spoke plainly, and refused to bow and scrape, you would sooner or later become a thorn in his side. My Alex was exactly that type. He worked diligently, never played dirty, never stole credit, and certainly never stooped to the kind of games required to curry favor with superiors. He did his job well, but he didn't know how to wrap his integrity in a soft, palatable shell. As a result, in an environment where sycophancy was considered a survival skill, my husband became an outlier. I remember once, a colleague who was friendly with Alex stopped by our house to pick up some documents. As he was leaving, he hesitated at the gate before saying quietly, "Elena, please keep an eye on Alex for me. I think Frank has him in his sights." I asked, "In what way?" He glanced around as if afraid of being overheard, then lowered his voice. "The kind of way where he holds a grudge. In this company, if you make Frank lose face once, he never lets it go." After saying that, he got in his car and drove off, leaving me standing there with a heavy feeling in my heart. That evening, when Alex came home, I told him about the warning. He just sat down, took off his watch, and gave a dry laugh. "If I do something wrong, I'll take the consequences. But if I'm right, I'm not afraid." He had said that to me more than once, but for some reason, hearing it that time made me feel both proud and worried. Proud that he could maintain his integrity in such a manipulative environment. Worried because that very integrity could easily be used as a pretext to crush him. In a place like his company, right and wrong were often not the deciding factors. The one in power was the one who defined right and wrong to suit their own needs. Closer to the date of the dinner, Alex told me something else that solidified my suspicions. This year's event wasn't just for employees, they were also inviting clients and a few important external guests. Hearing that, a chill went down my spine. A man like Frank Thompson, if he truly wanted to make an example of someone, wouldn't choose a private moment. He would choose the most public, most formal occasion possible, so that the humiliation would land harder, hurt more, and be remembered longer. And his insistence that my husband bring his wife by then, I no longer saw it as a social courtesy. It could have only one purpose: to make the humiliation complete. It wasn't just about stomping on Alex in front of his colleagues. It was about dragging his family into it so he would have no retreat, no way to save face. It was a deeply vicious attack on a man's pride. But I didn't voice these thoughts to my husband. I knew he was already stressed, and saying it out loud would only add to his burden. I just quietly prepared my outfit, prepared my mind, and resolved that if something did happen that night, I would not let my husband stand alone amidst a tenuous sea of condescending stares. Sometimes, a woman doesn't need to say much. She just needs to be in her rightful place. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that my place that night was by my husband's side, even if they deliberately put us at the lowest table in the room. I had thought that after seating us at the back table, Frank Thompson would be satisfied and leave us in peace for the rest of the evening. But I was wrong. For a person like him, it wasn't enough to just watch someone be humiliated. He had to personally twist the knife, to make sure the person he was targeting had no possible way to hold their head up. The torment that night went much further than I had imagined. The appetizers had barely been served when the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly. Frank Thompson stood up, holding his wine glass, his voice booming across the room. He wasn't using a microphone, but he spoke loudly and slowly, as if every word had been carefully chosen beforehand. Tonight, besides having a good time, I want to remind everyone of something. In this company, every person needs to know their place. Sit in the right seat, do the right job, and you'll have a long career here. Hearing that, I need to turn around to feel the dozens of eyes that had shifted toward our table. The phrase, sit in the right seat, was delivered with a casual air, but everyone in that room knew exactly who it was aimed at. Our table instantly became the table A's center of unwanted attention, a target that he had deliberately painted for everyone to see and remember. A few people looked down at their plates, pretending not to hear. Some glanced our way and quickly looked away. But others couldn't hide their smug satisfaction. From somewhere behind me, I heard a hushed whisper, "He's definitely on the blacklist." Another voice replied. Immediately, I heard he argued with the boss in a meeting. They spoke softly, but at our quiet table, every word landed like a stone. I didn't turn around. I didn't ask who was speaking. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that people were already accepting the narrative that my husband was being publicly disciplined. Beside me, Alex maintained the same straight-backed posture he'd held since we sat down. He didn't lower his head or show any fear, but I could see the hard line of his jaw, and the way his hand, hidden under the table, was clenched into a tight fist. I knew the pressure on him was immense. He was likely fighting every instinct to stay calm, to not stand up and walk out, and to not put me in an even more awkward position. I quietly placed a piece of food on his plate and said softly, "Eat something, Alex. I'm here for whatever happens." At my words, Alex turned to look at me. A flicker of surprise crossed his eyes before quickly softening. We had been together for so many years that sometimes, a short sentence was all it took to understand what the other person needed. I knew he didn't need me to cause a scene right then. What he needed was a quiet anchor, a reminder that in this room full of judging eyes, he was not alone. But the people at the main table seemed determined not to grant us a moment of peace. Jessica, the assistant who was always by Frank's side, tilted her head toward our table and said, just loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "Wow. The service at that table is slow, isn't it? I guess they don't prioritize unimportant guests." As soon as she finished, the group around her erupted in laughter. One of them even raised a glass to his lips, pretending to be laughing at an innocent joke. But I knew it wasn't a joke. It was a deliberate kick while we were down. As if on cue, a server who had been heading toward our table with the next course stopped in his tracks. A manager near the service door gave a subtle hand signal, a tiny gesture that I caught. The server paused, diverted the tray of food to the table next to us first, and only then circled back. Seeing that, my heart grew cold. So it wasn't just words. Even the service was being manipulated to fit the script Frank Thompson had written. Sitting next to me, the janitor, a man in his late 50s, let out a soft sigh. He spoke so quietly that I could barely hear him. "We're used to this, but you two don't deserve it." His simple words caught in my throat. The very people considered the lowest at this event were the only ones showing any decency. I turned and smiled at him, my voice calm. "It's all right. The ones to be pitied aren't always who you think." He looked at me, a bit stunned, perhaps not fully understanding my meaning. But Alex did. He turned to look at me again. This time, his expression was different. It was no longer just surprise. It was as if he was beginning to realize that I wasn't sitting here to simply endure the humiliation. And at that exact moment, Frank Thompson made his way over. He walked from table to table with his wine glass, smiling and making small talk, putting on the air of a friendly, approachable boss. When he reached our table, he stopped, placing a heavy hand on my husband's shoulder and patting it a few times in a show of false camaraderie. "Comfortable over here, Alex? Good to get close to the working folks. Builds character." His tone was meant to sound encouraging, but every word dripped with condescension, as if he were bestowing a great favor upon my husband. Before Alex could respond, I looked up. For the first time that evening, I looked directly into Frank Thompson's eyes without flinching, without offering a polite social smile. It was just a normal look, but it was direct enough, cold enough, to make him pause for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The hand on my husband's shoulder lingered for a beat before he pulled it back. He didn't say anything else, just let out a short, dry laugh and turned away. In that moment, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Frank Thompson had crossed a line. This was no longer just about being rude or disrespectful. He was intentionally turning my husband's honor, and our honor as a couple, into a spectacle for his own amusement. And once a person like me has seen someone's true face, once I've determined that tolerance only invites further aggression, the price they will eventually pay will not be contained to a single dinner party. The atmosphere in the ballroom grew thick, as the wine began to flow more freely. At first, there were the sounds of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and invitations to try the fish or the soup. But after the pointed jabs at our table, all of it sounded forced. Everyone knew this evening had strayed far from a normal company dinner. What they didn't expect was that Frank Thompson intended to push it even further. He stood up again, this time holding a microphone. The spotlight from the ceiling illuminated his face, giving it the artificial glow of someone who loves being the center of attention, the one holding the power to speak. He raised his glass, smiling as if he were about to deliver a heartwarming speech. "Tonight, besides celebrating the quarter's success, I want to remind everyone of one thing. In this company, an employee must first know where they stand. Know your place, and you'll go a long way." The room fell quiet for a beat. The words sounded like a general piece of advice, but no one was fooled. As soon as he finished, he suddenly called out, "Alex, come up here and have a drink with me." Those few words were like a spotlight swinging across the room, landing directly on the back table where my husband and I sat. All eyes turned to Alex. I heard the faint scrape of his chair on the floor as he stood up. He straightened his jacket, smoothed his cuffs, a small gesture to maintain his composure, and walked toward the front. But I saw, in that moment, that his hand was clenched into a tight fist. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on him. There are times when a woman can do nothing more than watch her husband, so that if he turns to look back, he sees that she is still there. Alex stepped onto the small raised platform near the platform main table and took a glass of wine from a server. Frank didn't clink glasses right away. He moved the microphone away from his mouth slightly and asked, his voice loud and clear, "Alex, you've been here a while. Tell me, in this company, who makes the final decisions?" The question hung in the air, freezing the room. This was no longer a friendly toast, it was a public interrogation. I saw a few people at the main table immediately look down, pretending to check their phones, pick at their food, or wipe their mouths. They didn't want to watch, because to watch was to understand, and to understand would make it impossible to pretend that nothing was happening. Frank, however, kept the smile on his face, a smile that only made the air colder. Alex held the Persibote glass in his right hand, his voice steady. The executive leadership, sir. Frank let out a short, sharp laugh. He tilted his head. The leadership? Who? Specifically? Don't be so vague. His words made a few people nearby flinch. I knew my husband was being backed into a corner. If he said Frank's name, it would be an act of submission, and acknowledgement of the power of the man who was deliberately humiliating him. But if he dodged the question, or remained silent, Frank would use it as further ammunition. I saw Alex's shoulders tense. He paused for only a split second. Before answering, the director. Frank burst into a loud laugh that echoed through the room. He raised his glass high, as if he had just received the most satisfying answer possible. Good. Then remember that in this place, those who are wrong will pay a price. He emphasized the words, pay a price, and they sounded chillingly cold. My heart clenched. Not out of fear, but because I understood he was no longer holding anything back. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he turned halfway toward my table, his voice still sweet, but sharp as a needle. And your wife, here tonight, surely she must understand where her husband stands now, right? A few laughs broke out, louder. This time, they were no longer polite chuckles, but a mix of morbid curiosity and pity, the sound of an audience watching a character they know is about to be pushed further into the mud. Someone even whispered, loud enough for me to hear, how pathetic. Hearing those words, I almost laughed. Pathetic? The most pathetic person in this room tonight was certainly not me or my husband. I set my fork down. My movements were slow, deliberate. The very calmness of my actions made a few people at my table look up. I stood up, smoothed my blouse, and raised my head. The distance from the back table to where Frank stood wasn't far, but at that moment, the entire room's attention was focused on that space. I didn't walk forward right away. I just stood where I was, allowing everyone to see that I was not cowering as they might have expected. My voice, when it came, was not loud, but every word was clear. I know where my husband stands better than anyone in this room. As soon as I spoke, the room fell silent. Some statements don't need volume to stop the laughter of an entire room. I saw Frank's eyebrows raise, his expression momentarily stunned. He probably never expected the wife who had been seated with the security and janitorial staff would dare to talk back in the scale middle of his performance. He laughed, but the sound was strained. Oh? Then why don't you tell us where your husband stands? The room held its breath again, watching me. Even Alex, on the platform, turned to look down at me. I could see the worry in his eyes, the surprise, but also a quiet, steady flicker of trust. As for me, I didn't answer immediately. I just looked straight at Frank Thompson for a few seconds, long enough for the smile on his face to begin to stiffen, long enough for the entire room to feel the undercurrent rising beneath the silence. That very silence was what made the atmosphere heavier than any shouting match could have. Because at that moment, everyone understood that I had not stood up to beg for mercy, nor to cry and save face for my husband. I had stood up to say something. And when a woman who has endured in silence all evening chooses to stand up at this exact moment, what she is about to say will certainly not be as gentle as Frank Thompson had planned. I took a few steps forward, but didn't walk directly up to Frank Thompson like I was starting a brawl. I stopped at a measured distance, slightly to his left. That stance wasn't accidental. I didn't want to seem like I was attacking him, but I absolutely refused to be in a submissive position. Sometimes, your posture alone says a great deal. I looked straight at him and spoke slowly. I wasn't aware that in this company, a person's value is determined by their seat at a party, and not by their actual competence. The words had barely left my mouth when the tables nearby went completely silent. A woman who was about to raise a glass to her lips froze mid-air. A man near the stage turned to the person next to him as if to ask if he'd heard correctly. No one had expected me to open with a line like that, right? When they were all waiting to see me shrink, or plead for the ordeal to be over. Frank Thompson let out a harsh laugh, but it was no longer as smooth as before. He tilted his head back slightly and shot back. Are you trying to teach me how to manage my team? It sounded like a simple retort, but I knew it was a classic tactic to paint the other person as insubordinate, to turn someone speaking the sixth truth into a troublemaker. I shook my head and replied succinctly. No. I just find this method a bit outdated. A small ripple of unease went through the day/room. I heard someone take a sharp, quiet breath. Others stared at me, probably trying to reconcile the image of the woman who had been sitting at the back table with the one now responding to a director with a voice that didn't waver. I overheard a whisper. This is getting intense. Just those few words were enough to signal that this dinner party had officially gone off script, with no turning back. I didn't give Frank time to regain control. I continued immediately, my voice even, not too high, not too low. How Alex performs at his job is not for me to say. But if he is being treated this way simply because of a professional opinion he offered in a meeting. I deliberately left the sentence unfinished, letting it hang in the air. Some truths don't need to be spelled out. Leaving them half said can make the listener feel more implicated than a direct accusation. And just as I expected, Frank froze. It was only for a beat, a fraction of a second, but anyone paying attention would have noticed. It was the first time all evening that his expression had lost its triumphant certainty. He immediately cut me off, his voice sharper than before. What are you implying? I didn't back down. I looked him straight in the eye and gave an even shorter reply. I think you know. The atmosphere truly began to shift then. If, at the beginning, people had viewed this as a boss putting an employee in his place, with the wife as collateral damage, now many of them were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I saw a few faces change color. A man at a table near the stage frowned slightly, as if remembering something. A young female employee leaned close to her neighbor, whispering so fast her lips barely moved, but the shock in her eyes was obvious. It turned out that the incident in the meeting wasn't unknown, it was just that no one had ever dared to bring it up in front of Frank Thompson. I stopped looking at the crowd and turned toward Alex. My husband was still standing there, the wine glass in his hand, but the look in his eyes was no longer one of worry. It was one of intense focus. I asked him, each word clear and deliberate. Alex, I'm asking you honestly. Were you wrong that day? I didn't ask to test him. I asked so that the entire room could hear the answer from the man himself, not through distorted rumors, pitying glances, or manipulative seating arrangements. Alex barely hesitated. He answered immediately, his voice firm and short. No. Just one word, but I knew he had poured all of his self-respect into it. I nodded, turned back to Frank Thompson, and continued. Then the problem doesn't lie with him. I didn't need to add anything else. The intelligent people in the room understood. And for those who chose not to understand, no amount of explanation would have made a difference. Frank Thompson's lips tightened, his hand gripping the microphone. He tried to keep his voice steady. You speak as if you were in that meeting yourself. I replied instantly. I don't need to have been there to know who did the right thing, and who is trying to turn another person's integrity into a tower. Personal offense. As soon as I said that, the chatter from the tables below grew louder, no longer hushed whispers but open glances and murmurs between guests. I knew that from this moment on, the game had changed. Before, Frank had dragged my husband onto the stage to force him to bow his head in front of a crowd. But now, Frank himself was the one being forced to explain, to confront the very thing he wanted no one to mention. The thing that powerful people fear most isn't being argued with. It's when a truth they tried to bury is suddenly lifted up and placed directly under the spotlight, in front of everyone. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't resorted to insults or accusations. I just said what needed to be said, mentioned what needed to be mentioned. But sometimes, a light touch in the right spot hurts more than a slap. And I could see that truth written all over Frank Thompson's face. For the first time since the evening began, he was no longer the one in control of the room. The microphone was still in his hand, but the power was gone. And I knew I had only just opened the first door. Behind it, there was a whole network of truths waiting to be revealed. The moment I finished speaking, the room was so tense. You could have cut the air with a knife. The sycophantic laughter was gone, as were the pitying, half-hidden glances from before. Now, people were looking at each other with questioning expressions. Because, once the conversation turned to the meeting, the data, and paying a price, this was no longer a simple case of a boss hazing an employee for sport. It had touched on something far more sensitive. Responsibility, competence, and the very stability of the positions some people held. I stood still, saying nothing more. Sometimes, saying less is more powerful. Because when you stop at the right moment, you force others to remember, to connect the dots, to dig up the things they saw but pretended to forget. And, just as I predicted, a few seconds later, the silence was broken by a raspy voice from a table in the corner. It was a man in his late 50s, thin, with graying hair. I vaguely remembered him from the compliance department. He stood up slowly, still holding his unfinished drink, and said, his voice quiet, but every word clear, if that data hadn't been corrected that day, we would have signed a faulty contract. Just that one sentence was like a boulder dropped into a still pond. A wave of murmurs immediately spread through the tables, much louder than before. Frank Thompson spun toward the man who had spoken, his voice so sharp and high. It betrayed his panic. Sit down. Who gave you permission to speak? The way he yelled was no longer that of a manager maintaining order at a party. It was the desperate reaction of someone whose weak spot had just been hit. And when a bruster leader loses his composure in public, the situation begins to slip from his grasp. The older man flinched at being yelled at, his face paling slightly, but having already stood up, he couldn't just sit back down. He clutched his glass and added, as if to bolster his own courage, I'm not lying. Everyone there saw it. As soon as he finished, someone else at a table near the stage chimed in. This time, it was a younger man's voice, a bit shaky but determined to get the words out. That's right. The discrepancy was almost $1 million, it wasn't a small mistake. The phrase, almost $1 million, shot through the room like an electric current. People turned to stare at Frank, some frowning, others looking up quickly as if a long-held suspicion had just been confirmed. The situation was now completely out of control. This was no longer a dinner party. It had become a venue where long, suppressed truths were cracking open all at once. I didn't interject. I didn't need to add any more fuel to the fire. I just stood still, my eyes fixed forward, letting the voices rise on their own. From the people in that room. I knew that if I continued to attack, Frank would have an excuse to frame the whole thing as an insubordinate employee's wife meddling in company affairs. But if I stayed silent, the people involved would have to confront each other. And when the truth comes from insiders, it carries more weight than any accusation from an outsider. Beside me, Alex was still on the small platform, but his expression had changed. I saw a flash of shock in his eyes, followed by a dawning realization as if the Rias pieces were finally clicking into place in his mind. He was probably just now understanding why he had been constantly nitpicked, berated without cause, and put in such bizarrely awkward situations recently. It wasn't random. It wasn't bad luck. He was being retaliated against for daring to point out a mistake in front of a client. Alex turned and looked at me, and his gaze made my heart ache. It held surprise, emotion, and a silent, gentle reprimand, as if asking, "How did you know all this and not tell me?" But I didn't need to answer with words. Just the sight of me standing there, still calm, was enough for him to understand. Some things I didn't say, not to hide them from him, but because I was waiting for the right moment, a moment when the truth could no longer be twisted. The feeling of the entire room's eyes turning on him with a new, critical perspective must have made Frank panic. He grabbed the microphone again, scanned the room, and growled, "This is an internal company matter. It's none of an outsider's business." The comment was clearly aimed at me. He wanted to drag the narrative back into his familiar frame. This is company business, you're just an employee's wife, so be quiet. But he had forgotten one simple fact. He was the one who had turned this internal matter into a public humiliation in the first place. I responded instantly, not too fast, not too slow. "But you're the one who made it a public spectacle." My short reply left him no room to maneuver. As I spoke, I heard a few sharp intakes of breath from the clients' tables. They weren't part of the argument, but their faces showed clear disapproval. A man in a gray suit at a table to the right leaned over and whispered to his companion, "This is highly unprofessional." The words were quiet, but in the tense atmosphere, every whisper was enough to tip the scales further. I looked directly at Frank Thompson, no longer beating around the bush. I spoke slowly, enunciating each word for him and the entire room to hear. "You're not trying to teach your employees their place. You're trying to hide your own." I held his gaze without blinking. The room was utterly silent, a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't silence born of fear, but of hearing a statement that hit the nail so perfectly on the head, articulating what many were thinking, but no one had dared to say. Your own place. For a man like Frank Thompson, who lived by his public image and said superficial authority, those words were the equivalent of having his suit stripped off him in front of a crowd. And for the first time that evening, Frank Thompson could no longer smile. The corners of his mouth were frozen, his eyes darkened, and his hand gripped the microphone so tightly the veins stood out. The confident, condescending, superior air he had worn all night had vanished. Standing before me was not a boss making an example of a subordinate, but a man whose dirty motives had just been exposed under the bright lights. And I knew, in that instant, that the game was no longer his to control. Just as Frank's smile vanished, a side door to the ballroom swung open. A man in a sharp black suit with a manager name tag walked in briskly. I had seen him a few times in the lobby earlier, but this was his first appearance inside the ballroom. This time, he didn't look toward the main table, or at Frank, as hotel staff usually would with the event host. He walked directly toward me. Then, in front of the entire room, he stopped. About 2 feet away, gave a slight bow of his head, and said clearly, "Elena, we have a small issue that requires your input." That one sentence was enough to freeze the room again. I distinctly heard the soft clink of a glass against a plate from a nearby table. A young female employee looked up so fast, her expression was one of pure bewilderment. His form of address was not how one speaks to a regular guest, and it certainly wasn't how one speaks to the wife of an employee who had just been banished to the back of the room. Frank Thompson's brow furrowed instantly. He turned on the manager, his voice sharp. "What is this? Can't you see we're in the middle of a private event?" It was the reflexive snap of a man used to being obeyed. But this time, the person he was snapping at didn't flinch or back down like one of his subordinates. The hotel manager maintained his polite demeanor, but his voice was firm. "I apologize, sir, but this is a matter that directly concerns our establishment." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. I didn't look at Frank anymore. I leaned toward Alex and said, just loud enough for him to hear, "Stay here with me." It was a short command, but I knew its meaning. All evening, he had been the one dragged onto the stage, interrogated, and forced into the most vulnerable position. Now, I didn't want him standing there alone like prey under a spotlight. I was pulling him back to my side, back into a position of strength. Alex looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a storm of emotions in his eyes. Surprise, concern, and a deep question he probably hadn't even had time to form. But he didn't ask. He stepped down from the platform and came to stand right beside me. We didn't hold hands or make any grand gestures, but just standing together like that sent a clear message. We were a united front, not to be picked apart. I turned back to the manager, my voice calm. "You can say it here." As I said it, the tables nearby seemed to hold a collective breath. Everyone knew the story had taken another sharp turn, but no one could guess where it was heading. The manager nodded and spoke, his words precise. "The event contract for tonight was approved directly by you, so we need to confirm a few issues that have arisen." He took a half step back, as if that was all he needed to say. But that alone was enough to stun the room into silence. I heard someone behind me let out a tiny, disbelieving gasp. A man at a client's table dropped the napkin he was holding. And Alex, standing next to me, went completely rigid. I didn't turn to look at him, but I could feel the shock radiating from him. My husband knew I worked, knew I wasn't just a homemaker as others assumed, but he probably never imagined that my work was connected to this very hotel, to this hospitality chain, to to the point where the manager would interrupt a major event to ask for my directive on the spot. Frank's reaction was different. It wasn't just shock, it was panic. The color drained from his face so quickly it was startling. He stammered, the words, barely coherent, all his earlier bluster gone. You approved the contract?" I didn't answer him. I had no desire to explain myself to a man who had just tried to use my husband's honor as a party favor. I just asked the manager, "What's the problem?" He replied immediately, his voice even and clear. "We've received a complaint regarding guest discrimination and interference with our service protocol during tonight's event. If this complaint is validated, under the terms of the contract, we have the right to file a formal report and suspend service immediately." This time, it wasn't just the employees who were buzzing. The clients' tables were in an uproar. A man near the window stood up, frowning at his companion. "Well, that's not very professional." Another at the next table put his glass down with a thud. "To invite guests and then treat them this way. That's just bad business." Those comments weren't aimed at me or Alex. They were aimed squarely at the event's organization and the person behind it. I maintained a calm expression. Because at this point, the important thing wasn't who I was or what my title was. The important thing was that the entire charade Frank had built, the seating, the hierarchy, the knowing your place, was beginning to collapse on top of him. I glanced at Alex. He was looking at me as if seeing a part of his wife he never knew existed. It wasn't that he didn't respect me, I know he always has. But for years, I had chosen to stand in the background, to be quiet, to let him be the present public face of our family. Tonight, for the first time, he was seeing that the wife everyone thought was so quiet could, when necessary, stand in a very different place. I turned back to the manager and said slowly, "Proceed according to the contract." My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that no one in that room could mishear it. And in that moment, I knew the tables had turned. This was no longer about a boss on a stage teaching a subordinate his place. It was no longer about a wife at the back table being pitied. From that second on, everything would follow the Samus. Real rules, not the petty game of musical chairs Frank Thompson had invented to humiliate another person. After my instruction to proceed according to the contract, the atmosphere in the ballroom tightened even further. No one bothered to touch their food anymore. The wine glasses sat untouched on the tables. The steaming plates of food, served moments before, now seemed out of place in a room full of finely dressed people staring at each other with entirely new expressions. A moment ago, they had been watching us for entertainment. Now, they were looking at Frank Thompson as the man who might drag them all into a collective public embarrassment. I turned back to him. My voice was not loud, nor was it laced with the sharp anger one might expect. I just spoke with finality. "You wanted to teach others their place. Perhaps now you should reconsider your own." As the words landed, Frank's eyes narrowed. I could see the confusion and panic warring on his face. It was no longer the annoyance of being challenged. It was the dawning horror of a man realizing he had gone too far to turn back. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, a man from a client's table on the right stood up. He had been quiet all evening, a sharp man with neat hair and thin glasses, flanked by two junior associates. He placed his napkin on the table, his voice low but firm. "We came here tonight to do business, to maintain a professional relationship, not to watch your company discipline its staff in this manner." That statement was like a gavel striking in the middle of the room. It shattered any pretense of this being a joke, a misunderstanding, or a light-hearted moment that Frank could have used to smooth things over. Another person at his table immediately added, his tone even sharper, "If this is how you treat someone for doing the right thing, then your management style is seriously questionable. We can't build a long-term partnership on such an unstable foundation. We'll have to reconsider our position." The word reconsider shot through the room. I heard a sharp intake of breath from several of Alex's colleagues. They knew, better than anyone, the weight of those words coming from a client. It wasn't a momentary fit of anger. It was a direct threat to the business, to the contracts, to the very reputation Frank so often boasted about. The tide had turned so fast that even the spectators were caught off guard. An evening designed to push my husband and me to the bottom had transformed into a public unraveling of the man who orchestrated it. The initial looks of curiosity and pity directed at us had now shifted to Frank, replaced by suspicion, wariness, and even disgust. Alex was standing right next to me. All night, he had endured, had held back, had swallowed his anger to prevent the very brawling explosion that everyone else seemed to be anticipating. But now, I could feel a total change in him. He was no longer on the defensive. He took a half step forward, his shoulders squared, and looked directly at Frank. His voice was clear. I'm not afraid of being evaluated, but I will not be denigrated for speaking the truth. My husband's words were not long or flowery, but they made my heart swell with pride. Not because I was worried, but because I knew this was the man I had married. He could take a hit, he could be patient for the sake of the bigger picture, but when a line was crossed, he would not sell his dignity for a moment of peace. I glanced at him and gave a slight nod. We both understood. From this moment on, it was no longer about me protecting him, or him leaning on me. It was about us, standing together, on the same side. Frank must have realized he was cornered. He forced a laugh, a pathetic, twisted thing people use when they're trying to de-escalate a situation, but only reveal how weak their position is. He raised his hands as if to calm the rising wave of discontent. Everyone, please, let's not get carried away. It's just a misunderstanding. A little slip-up in the carried away seating chart. He hadn't even finished his sentence when I cut him off. It wasn't a slip-up. It was a choice. Frank stared at me, stunned. I continued, my words deliberate and precise. Assigning us to the back table was a choice. Instructing the staff to serve us last was a choice. Using an internal meeting to publicly shame him was a choice. There is no misunderstanding here. My statement silenced the room again. Because everyone knew I was right. A misunderstanding is an accident that one tries to correct. What Frank Thompson had done all evening was far too calculated, too seamless, to be called an NST accident. I turned to the hotel manager. Continue with the standard service protocol, and please document this entire incident. He immediately nodded. Yes, ma'am. That simple affirmation sent another ripple through the nearby tables. By now, no one I could delude themselves into thinking I was just a wife who had tagged along to a company dinner. And for Frank Thompson, that realization was more painful than any verbal blow. He had chosen the wrong person to humiliate, and his mistake was now unfolding, piece by painful piece, in front of everyone. The hotel staff began to move again, but it was different now. Food was served to every table equally. The service was respectful and uniform, with no table deemed more important or higher class than another. The return to normalcy only highlighted how abnormal the earlier situation had been. The room was so quiet I could hear a fork being set down on a plate at the far end. No one was laughing anymore. No one dared to make another snide remark. The smug looks from earlier had vanished, replaced by averted gazes, embarrassment, or cold calculation. I gently took Alex's hand under the table. His hand was still a bit cold, but it was the cold of someone who had just weathered a storm of indignation, not the cold of defeat. I whispered, just for him. Tonight, we weren't humiliated. They chose to humiliate themselves. Alex didn't reply right away. He just squeezed my hand, very gently. But I understood. In that glittering ballroom, the ones who would walk out with their heads held high were not the people who held the microphone, but the husband and wife who had been sent to the lowest table from the very start. The ballroom was now frozen in a state of suspended animation. The boisterous laughter from the beginning of the night was gone, as was the hushed, gossipy whispering meant to derive pleasure from another's shame. After my words and the defectormat hotel's response, all eyes began to shift. Before, they had been fixed on my debt husband and me, as if we were a strange spectacle. Now, they were all staring at Frank Thompson with a mixture of scrutiny, annoyance, and even a degree of caution. In that instant, I knew the dynamic had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just a story about a petty boss trying to humiliate a subordinate at a dinner party. The moment the hotel mentioned the dinner party contract, the moment company insiders brought up the meeting, the data, and the personal issue of accountability, it was no longer just Frank's character on display, it was his professional credibility. And once credibility is on the line, outsiders no longer sit back and watch for entertainment. The first to speak up was a client from a table on the right. He had been reserved all evening, mostly observing. Now, he slowly set his wine glass down. The sound of glass on the table was quiet, but it made the cable surrounding area fall even more silent. He looked directly at Frank Thompson, his voice level but as sharp as a razor. If this is how your organization treats its own people, how can we be sure the data you've provided us in the past is reliable? The question had barely been asked when I saw Frank's entire demeanor change. If everything that had happened before could have been spun as a misunderstanding or an awkward seating mistake, this question struck at the very core of the issue. It wasn't about saving face at a party anymore. It was a direct challenge to his competence and honesty as a representative of his company working with a partner. Frank immediately started stammering. No, that's unrelated. This is entirely separate from the data. But the way his words stumbled, the way his eyes darted away before snapping back, made his denial weaker than silence. Someone with a solid footing doesn't react that way. Only someone whose weakness has been exposed panics like that. I didn't say a word. I didn't even glance at the client to show my support. At this stage, the more I spoke, the more frank. I could try to frame this as a personal argument between an employee's wife and a personal argument. Supervisor. I stood quietly beside Alex and just watched, because I knew that once a client starts asking questions, the rest should be left to those with vested interests to confront each other. And just as I anticipated, another man from a table near the stage stood up right after. He was younger than the first, with a stockier build and a brisk way of speaking. He didn't beat around the bush. He asked directly. I propose a full audit of all recent reports. If there are inaccuracies, accountability must be established. We cannot sign off on new projects based on ambiguous trust. This time, the atmosphere didn't just buzz, it fractured. The employee tables broke into open discussion. People were frowning, biting their lips, leaning into Levin's whisper urgently to one another. I even saw a young woman at a far table give a slight nod to her neighbor, as if this development wasn't entirely surprising to her. It was clear that many surprising to her. People had harbored doubts for a long time. They just hadn't dared to be the sanets first to voice them. Once one person spoke up, the silent nods of agreement started to come out into the open. Alex, who had been standing silently beside me, finally moved. He took one step forward, naturally, without any prompting. His shoulders were back, his chin was slightly raised, and his voice was far clearer than when he had been called up for that forced toast. If a review is necessary, I am prepared to cross-reference all the data I am responsible for. Hearing him say that, I felt a mix of pain and pride. Pain that my husband had been pushed to the point of dado, having to stand in a room full of people and publicly affirm his own integrity. But pride, because, even in his moment of deepest humiliation, he chose to step forward with dignity rather than shrink back or blame someone else. On one side was a man being targeted, yet willing to take responsibility for his work. On the other was a man in power, yet full of denials. The contrast was so stark that no one could ignore it anymore. I turned to look at my husband. For the first time all evening, I saw him completely break free from his defensive posture. Before, he had been dragged onto the stage, interrogated, sent to the back table, and made the unwilling star of a public shaming. But from the moment he stepped forward to offer his data for review, his stance had changed. He was no longer the one being pushed down. He had become the one willing to face the truth, even if that truth might trigger a massive audit. That was likely what truly sent Frank Thompson into a tailspin. He growled, trying to muster the last remnants of his authority. I am the one in charge here. His shout was loud, but the force behind it was gone. It no longer sounded like a man in control, but like a cornered animal lashing out. As soon as he finished, the first client coolly replied, without a shred of deference. Then, that's all the more reason for an audit. That one sentence extinguished the last flickering ember of authority Frank was trying to hold on to. No one laughed. No one came to his defense. In that brightly lit ballroom, all that remained was the truth, being dragged out piece by piece, and a man who was still standing, but whose authority had crumbled some time before. And I knew, with certainty, that from the moment the client officially requested a review, This situation could no longer be salvaged with a few half-hearted apologies. That evening, Frank Thompson didn't just lose face in front of his employees. He had just personally opened a door, and behind it was the one thing he feared most, being scrutinized by the very numbers and responsibilities he had long used to force others to bow their heads. I had just finished my thought when the phone in the hotel manager's pocket began to vibrate. In the tense silence of the room, the small sound was startlingly loud. He excused himself, quickly stepping to the side to answer. I couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but I saw his expression shift. Before, it was one of professional seriousness. Now, his eyes held the caution of someone who understood this situation had escalated beyond a simple dinner party incident. He listened for less than 30 seconds, giving only 2 brief replies. Yes, sir. I understand. Then he hung up and walked directly back to me. This time, he didn't stop at a formal distance. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Just enough for me to hear. Ma'am, upper management has been briefed on the situation. I gave a small nod, not asking a single question. At that point, I didn't need to. In organizations like this, any incident involving clients, guest discrimination, and on-site reports during an event would be immediately escalated to the highest levels of corporate. An experienced person could tell, just by the manager's expression, how far up the chain this had gone. What I needed at that moment was not a private explanation for myself, but for the entire room to understand that this was no longer in Frank Thompson's hands. The manager turned back to face the room, stood in the center of the aisle, and announced in a clear, professional tone that no one could pretend not to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a formal complaint regarding inappropriate conduct during tonight's event, our executive office has instructed us to create an official report on site to document the entire incident. The room erupted in a fresh wave of murmurs, not the curious whispers from before, but the sound of many people simultaneously realizing the situation had just leaped to a new level. A woman near the door blurted out, "An official report? Right now?" People leaned toward each other, asking questions more to themselves than to anyone else. Because everyone understood that once the venue starts creating a formal, public report, this could no longer be brushed off as an internal misunderstanding or a joke that went too far. It had now touched upon procedure, contracts, and the legal responsibilities between the event host and its clients. Frank Thompson practically lunged forward. He took a half step, his face flushed, his voice sharp with desperation. "Who gave you the authority to do that? This is my company's party. You're overstepping." But the more he protested, the weaker his position seemed. He no longer sounded like someone in charge, but like a man lashing out after being silenced. The manager didn't retreat. He replied politely, but without backing down an inch. "Sir, we are acting in accordance with the signed contract. When there is a complaint related to service arrangements, guest seating discrimination, and actions that negatively impact the event experience, our operations team is authorized to document it on site." The phrase, "in accordance with the signed contract," hung in the air. I knew it was time for me to stop holding back. Some things, if said too early, sound like boasting. But to remain silent at this moment would make it seem like I was hiding behind procedure to corner him. I looked straight ahead and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. I approved that contract. If the room had been buzzing before, it now felt like it had exploded. I distinctly heard several people gasp, "What?" At the same time, a man from a client's table set his glass down so hard that wine sloshed over the rim. People spun in their chairs to stare at me, as if to confirm they hadn't misheard. All evening, they had seen a plainly dressed woman forced to sit with the support staff, who then stood up and spoke more sharply than expected. But now, they were finally putting the pieces together. A man from the client group near the stage asked bluntly, "Are you with the hospitality chain's operations team?" The question was natural, not an interrogation, but the genuine reaction of someone who had just realized they had completely misjudged the person standing before them. I didn't look around to savor the moment. I just answered simply, "I'm responsible for service standards." I said it that way intentionally. I didn't need to state a long, fancy title, nor did I want to turn this into a dramatic reveal for applause. Just one phrase, responsible for service standards, was enough. Anyone in the industry would know that wasn't a small role. And those who didn't would at least realize. I wasn't the type of wife who just tags along to company events, as Frank Thompson had assumed. I didn't turn to Alex right away, but I could feel his eyes on me. His expression was no longer one of bewilderment. It had deepened into something quiet and profound, as if he finally understood why I had been so calm all evening, why my few words had been so impactful, and why I had stood my ground without flinching. It wasn't because I was tougher than anyone else, it was because I knew the rules of the game here, knew them so well that I knew exactly when to speak and when to be silent. Frank, on the other hand, was now truly floundering. I saw his lips move several times, as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. His mind was likely racing, trying to figure out who invited whom, why someone like me was connected to the contract, and how his actions all evening would now be re-evaluated in this new light. There was nothing left of his initial smugness or sadistic pleasure. All that remained was the stunned rigidity of a man who had just discovered that the stage he'd built had turned its brightest spotlight directly on him. I looked at him, not with a glare or a triumphant smirk. I just said, slowly, as if driving each word into the center of the room, you chose the wrong person to play games with. Not a single person laughed. No one interjected. The statement fell into absolute silence. And because of that silence, it carried immense weight. I didn't say who I was. I didn't boast about my position. I didn't need to list what I was capable of. That one sentence was enough. Because for a man like Frank Thompson, the greatest humiliation isn't being yelled at. It's realizing that you tried to drag the wrong person through the mud, only to find that, in front of everyone, you're the one standing in the process lowest place. After I said, you chose the wrong person to play games with. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. No one had the appetite to lift a fork or a glass. The hot dishes that had been served earlier were still steaming, untouched. The atmosphere of a rowdy corporate dinner had morphed into the Tomine. A public inquest, where everyone present was now wondering if they should continue to remain silent. The hotel manager wasted no more time. He turned to town, 2 staff members by the door, and gave a few quiet, brief instructions. A few seconds later, one brought a clipboard with an incident report form. The other brought a small internal audio recorder and a printed-out diagram of the ballroom seating. Everything was done with such crisp, professional efficiency that no one could mistake it for an empty threat. When the paperwork was laid out on an empty threat table near the aisle, everyone finally understood that the events of this night could not be erased with a few nervous laughs, as had happened at so many other parties. The manager announced clearly, we will now document each issue that arose during the course of the event, including the deviation from the original seating chart, interference with the order of service, and any statements made that impacted the experience of the attendees. Each point he listed was like another nail being hammered into a coffin. Frank stood nearby, his hands at his sides, his fingers curled into tight fists. I could see he was struggling to maintain what little composure he had left, but the effort only made his face more rigid, the veins on his forehead more prominent. What he likely didn't expect was that as soon as the hotel began its formal process, people who had been silent all evening began to speak up, one by one. First was a young male employee from a table near the exit. He stood, his voice a little shaky, but clear enough. I can confirm that the original seating chart was different. I heard Mr. Thompson tell someone to move Alex's table to the ride back. After saying that, he swallowed hard, as if he had just used up all his courage. Then, a woman from the administrative department slowly rose. She didn't look at Frank, but addressed the manager. When I walked by earlier, I heard an instruction to put Alex at that table, so he would be out of the fete way. I thought it was a joke, but then they actually did it. The room immediately started buzzing. The phrase "out of the way" was casual, but its bluntness laid bare the true, petty nature of the whole affair. The third person to speak was the maintenance worker who had been sitting at our table. He scratched his head, clearly uncomfortable speaking in front of a crowd, but he still said, when me and the guys were sitting there, someone came and told us that a couple would be joining us, and that we should just stay put. Don't move. Hearing that, I saw several faces in the room change. It meant that seating us at the back table wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, but had been planned in advance. With the first person standing up, the dam of fear holding everyone else back seemed to crack. People were no longer whispering cautiously. They were remembering, comparing notes, and realizing they had all seen clear pieces of the truth. The power dynamic had flipped. Before, everyone feared Frank because he was the Frankitas boss, the one who controlled their performance reviews, their projects, their ability to make their lives difficult. But with clients present, the hotel, filing a formal report, and the situation escalating beyond a simple scolding, the old fear began to lose its power. Realizing he was being cornered, Frank Sower forced a weak smile, trying to salvage the situation by softening his tone. "All right, everyone, let's not be so tense. It was just a misunderstanding in the arrangements. We had a big crowd, the staff got it wrong. I was just about to correct it." He didn't get to finish. I cut him off. Not because I was angry, but because I knew this kind of excuse all too well. When you can't deny something, blame it on a misunderstanding, on incompetent staff, on a joke that went too far. I looked him straight in the eye, and asked calmly, "A misunderstanding that was scripted in advance?" The question made a peephole. Few people visibly flinch, not just because of the word scripted, but because everyone was now remembering the scattered pieces from the evening. The text message, summoning a wife, the prearranged seating, the manipulated service, the data, pointed, personal insults. All of it added up. To still call it a coincidence was to be willfully blind. Alex, who had been standing by my side, finally stepped fully forward. I sensed a clear shift in my husband. It was no longer the forbearance of a man trying to keep the peace, but the calm resolve of someone who had seen his opponent's true face. He said, his voice quiet but as strong as steel, "If you wanted to make an honest example of me, you could have said it to my face. You didn't need to drag my wife into it." The room fell silent. Alex's words struck at the heart of that matter, not just for Frank, but for everyone who had sat there and laughed at another's expense. Because no matter how they tried to justify it, the truth was that a man had used his subordinate's wife as a tool to publicly humiliate him. That wasn't about management, it was about character. The silence was only broken when the client from the main table, the one who had spoken up before, slowly stood. He adjusted his cuffs, looked directly at the senior leadership from Alex's company, and stated, each word deliberate, "We will be temporarily suspending our partnership until your company provides a full and transparent explanation for this entire affair." That statement landed with the force of a sledgehammer. Everyone understood that what had started as a loss of face had now become a tangible loss of business. Not just rumors and gossip, but contracts, projects, money, and reputation. Frank stood there, frozen. I had never seen a man's expression change from smug satisfaction to ashen horror so quickly. He opened his mouth as if to protest, to hold on to something, but no words came out. In that moment, he probably finally understood that some games you think are fun, that make you feel powerful, that let you put others in their place, come with a price. And that price isn't paid in the laughter of the moment. It's paid in the consequences that follow, consequences that, once they slip from your grasp, can never be pulled back. I looked at him, no longer feeling the anger I had at the beginning. At this point, even anger felt pointless. I just said, my voice soft but clear enough for him to hear, "Some things you think are just games, but the price you pay is no game at all." After that, I didn't look at him again. Because in that instant, I knew with certainty that the person cornered in that room was no longer my husband and me. The one who was trapped, standing in a room full of sounds, eyes that had grown cold with distrust, was the very man who had thought he could arbitrarily push others to the back of the room for his own evenings entertainment. The party ended in a way no one could have anticipated. There was no final toast, no group photos, and no one lingered for polite small talk. People quietly stood up, pushed in their chairs, grabbed their coats, and left in an atmosphere as heavy as lead. The faces that had been flushed with wine and excitement earlier were now pale and drawn. Some kept their heads down, hurrying out the door as if afraid that staying a second longer would pull them into the mess that had just erupted. My husband and I didn't leave right away. I stayed for a few more minutes while the hotel staff finalized their paperwork. Alex stood beside me, not asking many questions, just silently observing. I knew. His mind must have been in turmoil. A company dinner that he thought would be, at worst, an unpleasant evening had spiraled into a public showdown with no turning back for anyone involved. But as I looked at him, I saw that the tension was gone from his shoulders. He was tired, yes, but his eyes were brighter. It was the look of a man who had finally been able to breathe after a long period of suffocation. That night, I'm sure we weren't the only ones who lost sleep. Shortly after we left the hotel, formal reports from both the client and the venue were sent directly to the senior executive board of Alex's company. Organizations like that don't run on emotions. Once there are official reports, public complaints, witnesses, and impacts on contracts and client relationships, no one can afford to look the other way. The era of closing the door and handling things internally was over, especially when outsiders had witnessed the ugliness firsthand. The next morning, just as I predicted, Alex's company convened an emergency meeting. He got the call very early. I was in the kitchen, making tea when his phone started ringing nonstop. He glanced at the screen, paused for a moment, and said, "They're calling me in." I didn't ask if he was okay, or offer any empty platitudes. I just set a mug of hot tea in front of him and said, "Go. You did nothing wrong, so you have no reason to bow your head." Alex nodded, but before he left, he hesitated at the door for a few seconds. I knew he was bracing for the worst. In that kind of environment, being right doesn't always guarantee you'll be protected. The truth sometimes needs time to be recognized, while a lie can be propped up for a long time if someone in power wants to protect it. I didn't blame him for being worried. I just felt for him. A man who had lived his whole life with integrity had to prepare to face the truth as if he were walking into an interrogation. I didn't go with Alex to his office. I wasn't at that meeting. From the beginning, I had chosen to stand behind him, and now that the necessary work was done, I intended to stay there. Sometimes, a woman steps forward to block a blow meant for her husband. But once the storm has passed, he is the one who needs to step back into the light, not her. I didn't want people to look at Alex and see a man who was propped up or saved by his wife. He didn't need that. What he needed was to be recognized for his own true worth. Around noon, Alex finally called me. But even before his call, I had a good idea of how things had played out. The evidence was overwhelming: the BT Hotel's formal report, the direct complaint from the client, the testimony from other employees, and the original issue of the altered data in the client meeting. Each piece, on its own, might have been explained away. But together, they formed a clear, undeniable pattern. It wasn't a coincidence, a joke, or a mistake. It was a calculated course of action, with malicious intent, that had caused real damage to the company. In the end, the inevitable happened. Frank Thompson was suspended from his duties, pending an internal investigation. The news spread quickly, not through loud, cheap gossip, but in the quiet, knowing glances exchanged in the hallway, in the silent understanding that his position was no longer secure. Several contracts were also put on hold for review by the client. The financial damage didn't need to be calculated yet. The tense atmosphere in the office was proof enough that the cost was significant. What brought me the most relief, however, was what happened next. Alex was called into a private meeting with a senior executive. He told me later that when he walked in, he was prepared for more pressure, maybe even to be asked to write a lengthy statement, as if he were a party to the trouble. But the outcome was completely different. The executive looked him straight in the eye and said, "You did the right thing, Alex. And you protected critical data for this company." That one sentence was enough to validate all the frustration he had swallowed for so long. Then came another sentence that, when Alex recounted it to me, left me speechless for a moment. The executive had said, "The fault doesn't lie with the person who makes a correction. It lies with the person who refuses to be corrected." It was a simple statement, but for a man like my husband, it was worth more than 1,000 compliments. Because finally, the integrity he had clung to, the straightforwardness that had made him a target, was being called by its rightful name. When Alex walked out of that meeting, he didn't feel the lighthearted relief of someone who had just shed a burden. He said the feeling was more like getting back something that had always belonged to him but had been deliberately covered in dust. It was acknowledgement. It was the feeling of no longer having to bow his head just because someone else was louder. It was the realization that all his years of doing the right thing, of living with decency, had not been thrown away as some naive, useless gesture. As for me, I was still at home, going about my day as usual. I cleared the cups from the table, refilled the water pitcher, and opened a window to let in the breeze. I wasn't at that meeting. I didn't need my name to be mentioned. Because from start to finish, I had never wanted to be the main character. I had only done what a wife should do when she sees her husband being pushed to his breaking point. Give him solid ground to stand on. And when he was able to walk out on his own, I stepped back again. That had always been my way. And perhaps that's why the recognition Alex received that day was truly his own. That evening, Alex came home earlier than usual. The rushed, hurried energy was gone, as was the posture of a man carrying a heavy internal burden while trying to appear normal. He walked in and stood in the middle of the living room for a long moment, like someone who had just walked through a heavy storm, not wet, but still feeling the chill. I was at the dining table, arranging the clean dishes. I looked up when I heard the door. In that one look, I knew that all the chaos of the day had finally settled. Alex came over and pulled out the chair across from me. He didn't speak right away. His hands rested on the table, fingers lacing and unlacing. He looked at me for a long time, so long that I felt I could hear the deep, slow exhale in his chest. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower and more raspy than usual. "I'm sorry I put you through that." I went still for a beat. Not because I was surprised, but because I knew how hard it was for a man like Alex to say those words. People think a man just needs to be a strong provider, to be the one who shoulders the burdens. But they don't always understand that a man's deepest pain isn't always from being pushed down or disrespected himself. It's from seeing the woman he loves being dragged into that same humiliation and feeling powerless to protect her. I looked at him and shook my head gently. No. We went through it together. Hearing that, his eyes reddened slightly. Not the redness of tears, but the look of a man who has been holding everything in for so long that a single touch of kindness makes his defenses crumble. He leaned back in his chair, quiet for a moment, then asked, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I knew what he was asking. Why I hadn't been more open about my work. Why I could read a situation so quickly, yet had remained quietly by his side for all these years. Why I had the strength to step up when needed but had never used it. To shield myself or to make him feel small. I looked at my husband and smiled. Softly. It wasn't a smile to diffuse the tension, but a way to finally say what I had held in my heart for so long. I spoke slowly. Because you don't need someone to stand in front of you. You need someone to stand beside you. After I said that, I saw Alex's expression freeze. It was probably in that moment that he fully understood the choice I had quietly made for years. I didn't hide myself out of fear. I just didn't want our marriage to become a crissipassa shadow cast over his self-respect. He was my husband. He had his own path, his own way of standing in the world. I never wanted anyone to look at him and say he got where he was because of his wife. Just as I never needed anyone to know how capable I was to feel my own worth. Alex reached across the table and took my hand. It was warm, no longer clenched. In that tense, desperate grip from the hotel. It was the gentle hold of a man who had finally been able to set his burden down. He said, so quietly it was almost a promise to himself. From now on, whatever happens, we face it together. I won't let you stand alone again. My heart softened. After everything, the thing that brought me the most peace wasn't that Frank Thompson had been suspended or that his colleagues were looking at Alex differently. The most precious thing was that the man sitting in front of me hadn't been broken by the ordeal. Instead, he saw his own value, and the value of the person walking with him, more clearly than ever before. I squeezed his hand and replied softly, "I never let you stand alone either." Saying those words, I felt the exhaustion of the past few days begin to melt away. Marriage, when you think about it, isn't just about the peaceful days of good food and calm nights. Some of the most beautiful marriages are not the ones that have never faced a storm, but the ones where, when the storm hits, two People still want to hold hands and walk through it together. One doesn't run before the other has a chance to fall. One doesn't use their strength to highlight the other's weakness. Just that is precious enough. Outside our home, the story of the company dinner would surely circulate for days to come. Some would tell it with satisfaction, happy to see an arrogant man get his comeuppance. Others would use it as a cautionary tale about how to treat subordinates. And some would only remember the part about a wife who was seated with the janitors, only to stand up and silence a room. But to me, all of that was just noise. It would be loud for a while, and then it would fade, like all stories do. What remains isn't about who won or who lost. I never felt like I won anything that night, and I certainly didn't feel a sense of smug satisfaction at having taught someone a lesson. Life has taught me that people who choose the wrong path will eventually pay the price, with or without someone else's intervention. What I'll remember most is a small moment in that glittering, judgmental ballroom. When my husband was called onto that stage, forced to answer those loaded questions, he still turned to look down at me. And I knew that as long as I was there, he wouldn't break. Just as I knew that if I were pushed to the point of standing up, he would stand with me, even if it took him a moment to catch up. I poured him a mug of hot tea. The steam curled up between us in the quiet kitchen. Alex blew on it gently, then looked up at me. His face no longer wore the heavy fatigue of the past few months. It was the same man, the same steady eyes, but deep within them was a new, different kind of strength. I looked at him, and my heart filled with a profound tenderness. I felt for him, for the difficult road he had to walk just to hold on to something that should be so simple. The right to do good work, to live with dignity, to be treated like a human being. I said softly, as much to him as to myself. Sometimes, people try to teach you your place. Alex listened, silent. I paused, then smiled. But in the end, they're the ones who don't know where they're standing. After that, neither of us said anything more. We didn't need to. Because some things, once you've known through enough pain, enough humiliation, and enough understanding, the silence that follows is the most gentle comfort of all.